Welcome to what's becoming the second talk in what might be a series here at the Wauwatosa Library. I gave a talk on existentialism back, I think in March or so, and that was much more general in orientation. If you're interested in seeing it, I can give you the link for it in YouTube. I'll pass out a thing where you can give your email later on. But so the previous talk was about existentialism as a movement. Who were the existentialists and what was it all about? This talk is more focused, and what we're going to do, if we keep this up, and since we're getting crowds for it, I think we probably will, is talk about specific themes that were very important for existentialist philosophy and literature. So this time we're going to talk about anxiety, which is a really big one, and human freedom, which is, also pretty important. And that's the sort of narrow topic, but we can talk about a lot of other stuff because these are connected to a lot of important phenomena. I'm sure we'll end up hitting on some discussions about the election, and people we were just talking before that perhaps some people might not be here because they're watching the DNC proceedings. So there's a lot of things in that light. We talk about anxiety, we can talk about the workforce, education, all sorts of things come to mind. I'm Greg Sadler. I don't think I know any of you yet. I'm a philosopher by training, although I no longer work for a college. I've moved out of traditional academic philosophy, although I still do some consulting, and now do more public and practical work with philosophy, including giving lectures like this and facilitating discussions. So I provide public talks and workshops. I do a lot of online content production. I have a YouTube channel that has about 1,000 videos in it now at this point and about 30,000 subscribers. I do ethics training, some consulting with organizations and businesses, some executive coaching, and some philosophical counseling. So existentialism is one of the sort of broadly speaking approaches that I use in some of my practical work, and I'm interested in these ideas because they do seem to have some practical application. The talk itself, there's no sort of prerequisite background or anything along those lines. I'm happy to, if something is confusing or hasn't been explained well enough, to pause and discuss it. We can take questions at any time, although I reserve some time at the end as well for questions and discussion. I'm very good at steering things back onto topic. I've been doing this public speaking thing for about 15 years. So if there's anything that seems like a digression to you, don't be too concerned about that. Could you hand this back? Sure. And then anybody else who comes in can just take them. So if you have any questions or comments, just ask away. You don't have to raise your hand or anything like that. So here's sort of an overview of what I've got planned for this talk, although, again, we can go off topic. I'm going to give a brief overview about existentialism as a philosophical movement, and I want to focus mainly on the themes that are most relevant to what we're talking about tonight. And then we'll have some discussion in a very general way about anxiety as a human emotion that we experience as a problem that's become quite acute in modern life, and as a phenomenon that we can examine. We'll also have some discussion about human freedom and some of the closely connected matters. And then we'll get into some actual existentialist philosophy and look at, there's 5 people that I picked out. There's others that are relevant to this, but I thought, why overload people? If you're familiar with other figures, you want to talk about them, we can certainly do that. The figures that I wanted to mention and then hit on a little bit are Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. So that's what we'll do. And like I said, we'll reserve some time for Q&A at the end, but I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments throughout the discussion. So existentialism, I'm sure all of you have heard of existentialism, right? At least not just seeing it in the title here. It's always puzzling to people when they get asked, well, what is existentialism exactly? And if you don't have a ready at hand answer, that's quite all right, because neither did the existentialists. As a matter of fact, they got into a bit of a, you might say, a pushing match, where some of them got kind of pushed out of the movement, mainly because of Jean-Paul Sartre. He cornered the market, you might say, on getting to define what existentialism was, and some of the other people were like, well, if that's what you mean by it, then I guess I'm not an existentialist anymore, including the people who first used the term, like Gabriel Marcel in France, and people like Heidegger in Germany. But we can give some broad characterizations of it, so we don't have to necessarily define it. One way to talk about it is that it consists in philosophical reflections on key aspects of human existence. And you might say, well, what does that leave out? Literature and psychology and theology and these other people who are doing stuff with existentialism? No, because they can be doing philosophy. Philosophy is a pretty broad field, and it's got very messy borders. So quite often, sociologists or pastors or all sorts of people find themselves doing philosophy, whether they realize it or not. But what would be these fundamental aspects of life? Well, birth and death, right? Those you aren't going to get away from. You're here, so you've been born. And unfortunately, the bad news is the mortality rate over any given period of time is 100%. You're going to die sooner or later. And this sounds very morbid, but it's really quite true. If you look around, everybody else in this room will either die before you, or after you, or at the same time as you. So either you're going to die later than them, and they're going to go out of your existence, or you're going to exit first, or who knows, maybe you'll all go at the same time. I will too. It's not something we can escape, so we ought to think about it. Heidegger talks about being towards death, and we'll hit on that and what it means a little bit later. Love and hate. A lot of times we think of philosophy as this abstract discipline. Sort of a pet peeve of mine is how philosophy gets taught in intro to philosophy classes at the college level, where it's presented as this very sterile excursus, when really, if you read philosophy and you read people from Plato on, love and hate are just running throughout the whole thing, and you can't really get away from it. And that's because those are key to our existence. Another pair that we might put in there, which some philosophers have tried to strip away, but other philosophers recognized as a fundamental part of the human condition: laughing and crying. Laughing is something that's essential to human beings. Hyenas laugh, but it's not really laughing, right? They don't laugh at a comedy special. And I suppose you can say animals do cry, but we cry a lot more than they do, right? And even tough guys cry. Odysseus in the Odyssey, when his shipmates die. If anyone tries to tell you warriors don't cry, the whole shipload of them are all bawling their eyes out. And there's something really fundamentally human about that. Adolescence and aging, this sort of notion of having life periods, and how do we sort them out? I was just talking with my 14-year-old daughter earlier this week about how I would, I realize she's actually going through all sorts of confusing questions and stuff like that, and I'm so happy I don't have to go through that again, because it was such a mess, and it always is. And every generation, it's always a new mess that we have to deal with. And then there's the horizon of aging. And society, culture, how does that bear upon us? What counts as society? The meaning of our lives, whether there is a meaning or not, whether we have to construct it, what we ought to strive for, whether we're free and how we're free, and then how we determine our life. These are the sort of things that existentialism grapples with. And there's other themes, too, that we could talk about. But I think that gives you kind of a general sense. This is a way of doing philosophy that's rooted in the human condition that everybody can experience, unless they're totally disconnected from other human beings. Another thing that's really important about the existentialists was, and again, they're a little bit opposed to other ways of doing philosophy that were prevalent at the time, and I think some other ones that are still around. They laid a great emphasis on affectivity. And what we mean by affectivity is our whole range of feelings and desires and moods, all those sorts of things. When we say people are getting emotional, we don't just mean that they have emotions, we also mean that they're desiring things, they're averse to things. And there's an interconnection between feeling and thinking. It's not as if these are totally separate realms for most of us. If they were, we'd be pretty dysfunctional people. And so the existentialists thought that this really mattered, that maybe in doing philosophy, mood or feeling could be as important as thinking or willing or the other things that philosophy tends to place on a pretty high pedestal. Another thing that they talked about that was very important was what we could call a confrontation between perspectives that present some kind of pre-given meaning of life, some order, some explanation, and the experiences that we have that show us that life is a lot messier than that. That the answers that we're given, sometimes they work for a while, but sometimes they break down. Maybe they turn out to be inadequate. And then what do we do in that situation? We say, oh, well, game's over, I guess we're done. Or do we try to move on and reconstruct something? If we're constantly jumping from one thing to another, the way some people do, for example, with self-help programs, they've got a whole shelf of self-help books, and each one is the replacement for the one that didn't work before that. They're not going to make much progress in that. So at a certain point, we actually have to deal with these messy matters ourselves and try to think about them and make sense of them. And we can say that existentialist philosophy, the stuff that we've got and the literature that we have, those are attempts, those are previous attempts by people who had a lot on the ball to try to do precisely that, to try to make sense out of this messy thing that we call life. Along with that goes a certain risk. Maybe there isn't a meaning to life. Maybe it's all nonsense. The proverbial tale told by an idiot signifying nothing. Maybe Shakespeare was an existentialist. Some people think he was. Or maybe it's mysterious. Maybe it requires our commitment and participation to derive anything out of it. Maybe it's ambiguous, where we can't get everybody on the same page, although we often strive to do so. So that's an important theme. Another key theme is the focus on committing oneself. And it's not just existentialists who say things like this. Pragmatists in philosophy do as well. William James has a beautiful essay called The Will to Believe. I'm sure some of you have read it, where he says that there are certain things that you're not going to get a decisive answer on until you commit yourself one way or another, and then you can retroactively look at it. So here'd be an example that he doesn't use that I like to use for students. Think about dating, and think about you find somebody attractive, and they could be a prospective, whatever boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, whatever they're going to be down the line. Now imagine that you were to stand back and say, I've got to look at this very objectively. What evidence do I have? What incontrovertible evidence can I amass that this person is the right person for me, or at least compatible with me? And you could maybe go on different dating websites and do some analyses and stuff like that. But people lie on those quite frequently, and the information isn't all that complete. You might go around and ask everybody, so what do you think of Jim? What do you think of Jim? You put together a composite picture and put it in a dossier with a report, and then finally go to them, 5 years later after you've compiled it and say, all right, I'm ready to date you now. And they would say, well, I've moved on. I'm no longer interested. It's not just a matter of time. There's certain ways in which you can't get to know certain things without committing yourself. And that's not to say that we have to do that with everything. Right? That would be a terrible idea to do with, say, mathematics. Unless I can feel my way into the equations, and experience them. No, you don't have to do anything remotely like that. But when it comes to the things that the existentialists are focused on, it does make a lot of sense. And so they say similar things to what James was saying. And so commitment to the self, and this is what's going to get us to one of our key themes. The inescapability of freedom, in some sense, even in a world that may seem or may actually be actively engaged in crushing or repressing freedom, in ruling it out in certain ways, or managing it. That's something that these guys were really quite interested in. So those, I hope, give you some vague sense, if you haven't read existentialist philosophy already, about what existentialists might be about. Let's talk about anxiety then, and then maybe we'll take a pause after we get through some of that and do some discussion or Q&A. So anxiety, like existentialism, or like freedom, or like any really important term, people have definitions. The definitions turn out to be less and less useful the more and more we get into it, in part because people don't always have the same thing in mind when they use this one single term of anxiety. And so we could look at perhaps two extremes and then think about the stuff in the middle. Some people use anxiety simply as a synonym for another very broad term of fear, right? So I'm anxious, I'm fearful. Some people use dread as a synonym for anxiety. We're going to see the existentialists will make a distinction there. When we look at, if you just Google psychotherapy and anxiety, and you'll find that, at least within the Anglophone sphere, anxiety ends up being this entire penumbra of different disorders. This is the terminology that gets used in contemporary work. And there's classifications ranging from phobias to post-traumatic stress disorder, from OCD to something even called generalized anxiety disorder. And you might say, well, what do they all have in common? Is it anxiety? Well, that's not super helpful when we're trying to figure out what exactly anxiety is. But it is useful to say, okay, it can be this, it can be this, it can be this. Sometimes a composite picture can be quite useful. And so that's sort of a clinical or medical, depending on what sort of paradigm we're using, perspective. Way over at the other extreme, we would have a more philosophical approach to it, like the one the existentialists developed, where anxiety is part and parcel of the human condition in some way. Maybe they're not talking about the same thing. I mean, there are people who used existentialist methods in psychotherapy and try to bring these things together, but perhaps we should say, well, these are distinct uses of the term, right? So we can't immediately jump from one to the other. And then we have this whole messy in-between where we talk about anxiety in our everyday life, because I don't think too many people, and this would be a good thing to ask somebody who actually is a psychologist, how often, even psychologists, when they use terminology like anxiety, they're not necessarily using it in the strict clinical sense, right? When they're talking with other people in their life.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, and same thing with philosophers. When a philosopher says, I'm anxious about the job interview I've got, they don't necessarily mean existential anxiety, right? They may tell their spouse that they do so that they can get some sympathy or something like that from them. But they often, philosophers can lie to themselves and their spouses or significant others just as much as anybody else about their motives, right? So, we can also distinguish other kinds or flavors or modes of anxiety. Some of these, I think, would bleed over into things that could be diagnosed and maybe hopefully treated. Some of these would bleed over perhaps into this more all-encompassing kind of anxiety. So people talk about, for example, free-floating anxiety, right? Where it's just a person is anxious. It could be something perhaps dispositional. They always seem to have something that they're worried about that's nagging at them. And they make a good effort oftentimes. I'm going to try to solve this, Really anxious about my closet and the fact that it's so messy and I can't find anything in it. Okay, great. So now you clean your closet out. Maybe even get a professional to help you out with it, right? So you can do it right. Well, then you find something else to be anxious about. My car is making a weird noise. Get the car fixed. I think my dog might be sick. We just go on and on and on. So that's something that many of us experience. There's another thing that people sometimes call catastrophic anxiety, and this is close to what we call dread. When somebody has this feeling that something is wrong and they don't know what it is, but everything's going to fall apart. It could actually be based on something, like when people have what's called imposter syndrome. Are any of you familiar with this? This has gotten a lot of discussion lately. Often people in professional roles may feel, I have actually quite a few business clients that this becomes an issue for. They may feel that they're not really up to what they're presenting themselves as, that they're kind of hollow, and they hope to God nobody figures out that they've actually been bluffing this whole time and they don't know this thing or have this set of skills. And oftentimes they really do have the skills, they just feel anxious about it. But that worry about somebody finally seeing through you, musicians have this too, and other creative people. Philosophers, there's almost a congenital disease for philosophers, I think, in part because our discipline is so ill-defined. That you can go to some other department and they're doing it in a totally different way, and they'll think you're a fraud and a charlatan, right? And so people can be quite affected by this. And then we can also talk about what we might call social or cultural anxiety. At different times and in different cultures or subcultures, people are really worried about particular matters. And it tends to sort of reproduction function. Since everybody's talking about it, it must be something that I should worry about. And social media probably has not helped us with this because now we're so much more connected and everybody's throwing all their stuff out there. So I didn't even know that I needed to worry about this thing or this thing or this thing until it came across my stream, right? It used to be I had to wait for my friends or coworkers or my family to bring something to my attention as a catastrophe waiting to happen or as a horrible injustice that might happen to me or my children. Or now I can just Google it and come up with all sorts of things. So that's something that we can point to. And cultural studies, will sometimes focus on just massive complexes. If you think about those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War, I grew up here in Wisconsin. I graduated in 1988 from high school. I would say that a lot of the guys that I hung out with and did sports with, we didn't actually expect to graduate from high school at one point. We thought, well, we're going to go to war with the Russians sooner or later. Probably, we were being a little bit alarmist. Probably the movie Red Dawn had too much influence upon us at the time. But that was a very strong anxiety running through our culture. And we were understandably anxious about it. We were close to people annihilating the planet if things went wrong. Fortunately, we're nowhere near that today. We have other problems that are equally pressing. But those would be social or cultural anxieties. And then we can contrast those to existential anxiety. So existential anxiety would be a more deep, pervasive, and ultimately inescapable sort of anxiety that would stem in part from our concrete existence, like the fact that we have bodies, and also our historical and cultural situation. But also from something in the very nature of human beings. That's what the existentialists are saying, that even if you manage to let's say we strip away the other kinds of anxiety. There are people who legitimately have to be diagnosed with particular disorders. They may be responsive to medication. They may be responsive to various forms of talk therapy. That's really great when that happens. And a lot of anxiety can probably be treated that way. Free-floating anxiety, some of that may actually fit into that. There's other ways in which people can perhaps deal with that as well. Meditations can sometimes help people. And we can go on and on. The cultural anxiety, maybe you can show people that we're not really at risk of the terrorists destroying everything, or the other political party, if they win the election, wrecking the country, or you can be realistic about these sorts of things, and perhaps some of the anxiety goes away. That's fine, but the existentialists are saying, and this is not something that we can verify in any sort of scientific way. They're saying that there's always some level of anxiety still there, and they're giving some reasons for why they think that to be the case. So before we go into that, I've got a set of sort of open-ended questions that I thought I was going to propose we think about, and we might have some discussion. One of these is, well, what do we actually have to be all that anxious about? You know, aren't things pretty good here in general, or maybe they're not? You know, we could think about what specifically makes us anxious, what triggers our anxieties. Another important question is anxiety something purely irrational? You know, like, are feelings just irrational? They have nothing to do with our reasoning or cognitive processes. They just are the way they are. Or is there kind of a rationality to anxiety, a kind of argument that it makes at times, sometimes substituting terms. If anxiety is making arguments, it often makes fallacious arguments, but those are still arguments. Or is it maybe something that transcends rationality? Maybe worrying about how rational our anxieties are is the wrong way to approach it. Another question the existentialists have to face is, well, what about people who say that they don't experience anxiety? You're saying everybody experiences anxiety. What about them? Do they get a pass? And the existentialists always say, well, they're feeling it, they're just not acknowledging it, they're not dealing with it. And there's usually a lot of truth to that when you start, looking at yourself or others. But do they feel anxiety even if they can't name it or recognize it? That's a good question. A couple things I also want to point out, and then maybe we'll pause for a little discussion. People do try to escape from anxiety by distracting themselves. I think we all have some experience with times when we have been anxious, probably not necessarily in an existential way, but about something that was, pressing upon us, something we were worried about. And we sought to lose ourselves. And nowadays people, binge watch Netflix. That's a common way to do it. But there's lots of other ways. Go somewhere else and hang out with other people. People talk about retail therapy. That's a pretty expensive way to deal with anxiety, but some people do that. And now we also live in a culture where for generations we've got whole industries that don't just cater to this wish to escape anxiety, but they actively promote that. And so we're at more of a disadvantage, I would say, with respect to anxiety than say Martin Heidegger was in his time. He wasn't bombarded by as much just media stuff flowing in as we are. Anxiety also drives people to aim for certainty, or at least the promise of certainty, making it a kind of project. And I think one of the things that's interesting to point out about this is, if you think about what certainty is not really an affective thing. It's more of a cognitive or intellectual thing. We say we're certain about something, we have good reason to believe that it's true. There can be certain affective elements involved, but what we're talking about here is something affective, a feeling, a drive, pushing us towards something cognitive. And so you see how it can flow into all sorts of things. And many times people will believe things because it helps them allay anxiety. And so we have to be on some guard about it. It can be in terms of the truth of things. It can be in terms of whether things exist or not, whether they're happening. It can be in terms of goodness. It can be in terms of unity. It can be in terms of whether things are beautiful or ugly, cool, whatever the opposite of cool is, all these sorts of things. And when we talk about those sorts of values, we're actually talking about something that in philosophy we call the transcendentals. There's a whole history there. Those are the big things that we can't ever get away from. So before I go on, any questions or comments, disagreements, worries? Hopefully this isn't making people anxious. That'd be terrible, yeah.
If I have my name is James. If I had been taught the framework of my environment, around a certain social construct,
Yeah.
okay, like being a man.
Yeah.
That's the construct. And so I grow up this way, and the environment says, well, you know, you're not supposed to cry, and all these other little things like that would be taught. So that's the social construct I grow up in.
Yeah.
And then I'm in a situation, let's say, where I get to college and whatever, and all of a sudden I start showing my feelings because I'm learning to get in touch with a place inside of me that I wasn't used to.
Yeah.
And I get real anxious about it because I don't know those things in me that I had missed that were always there.
Yeah.
And so I get ridiculed by, what are you crying about? Well, that was a really good movie.
Yeah.
And you should see, and so what happens is that here's this social construct. Here I am here. And now my experience is that I'm feeling real anxious because I'm not meeting the expectation of.
Yeah, there's a discord, and how exactly that discord should be handled. One of the things that we don't get the rules for when they give us all the rules is how precisely to handle those sorts of things, right? We have to sort that out on our own, and maybe we find some good advice here and there. And if we're really lucky, we have like somebody who we meet who's a model or who can kind of guide us through that, right? And you know, I've seen something similar with young men going to college. There's this incredible pressure. Not just, you know, I've taught at really low-tier schools where the students are coming from very tough backgrounds, almost all of them first-generation college, and I've also taught at schools that are like one step away from the elite. And I see this pressure, primarily on young men, to not be smart, to not pay attention, to screw around, you know, and I understand where that comes from because I felt something kind of similar when I was young, you know, long time ago, and it took a lot to overcome it. I mean, I would pretend to sleep in class when I wasn't sleeping in class, and just to, as you put it, satisfy a social construct. And we could like come up with all sorts of examples. What happens when you say, that's enough of that, I actually want to get A's in my classes, right? I actually want to be able to cry at something that affects me. It's a kind of rupture, and it can be extremely anxiety-provoking. And one reaction to that is, well, this was a terrible idea, I'll never do that again. You know, that's one way people deal with it. And we don't have, you know, nice hard and fast rules for dealing with that. This is why I think existentialist philosophy can be useful, not just like providing us like a blueprint that we have to follow, but in giving us some ways of thinking about it. So that can be helpful.
In a sense, we're free to examine
Yeah.
other approaches, and to be locked into one way doesn't make you a bad person.
Yeah.
That you have an opportunity to question,
You know,
to experiment, and there's a sense of freedom with that.
yeah, and we've turned college, among other things, when it works well, into a place where that can actually happen. Because we're removing, usually, I mean, a lot of non-traditional students too, and oftentimes they get more out of it than the 18-year-olds going in. But if you think about the role of college, we take 18-year-olds and we put them somewhere else, and we take them out of all those contexts where they were kind of stuck, and they have the chance to explore what they actually do desire, and what they do think. They have to do a lot of sorting things out, you know, which can be quite painful. You know, we throw in some other things too, like getting drunk and, you know, some certain social experiences, coming of age stuff. But yeah, and hopefully, you know, they graduate with a diploma at the end. So there's something fun to it. But yeah, so that's a good segue into freedom. So freedom itself is, you know, like anxiety, it's an even more ambiguous term. People mean all sorts of things by freedom. And I actually drew up a whole list, but I probably won't go through all of the different things that I came up with. And that's not a comprehensive list. So, you know, in one sense, people think that freedom is when you're not impeded. When, like, for example, this wallet is free to fall because I let it go. So it can do what it does and follow gravity. Now that can be just a mechanical thing, right? Animals can be free in that sense. Your dog is free to roam when you take it off the leash. We're free when we're not in prison cells, as Thomas Hobbes says. A person is perfectly free when they're in a prison cell to range between the different walls, but outside of that, they're unfree. That's not a very important sense of freedom. That's sort of a physical sense of freedom. A connected sense is when that we use today. We talk about freedom in terms of rights, and we talk about being free not only when we have rights, but when we can actually exercise the rights, because there's a lot of cases where we have rights and they don't do us any good, and then we have to go to court, and that takes forever. That's kind of an iffy thing. We can also talk about, and philosophers will typically talk about freedom as having multiple options and being able to choose between them, which is some sort of like what you're talking about, being able to choose multiple ways of looking at things. And so, along with that goes the implication that if we only have one option, we're not really free. Other philosophers have said, no, you could have just one option for yourself and be totally free if freedom means something like realizing your nature or making your way to the good. So, for example, in a religious context, St. Anselm, speculating about the people in heaven, says, could they go wrong? Could they choose to say, screw you, God? I've had enough here. No, they couldn't do that. But they couldn't do it not because there's an inability, but because, well, why would they do that? They're presumably in the presence of the greatest good, and it would be crazy to go against it. So that's another conception of freedom, when you're realizing what's best for you. Being free in the sense of being aware, being self-conscious, being able to determine for oneself what you'll think and what you'll think about. That's a conception of freedom that's been around for a long time. Also being able to refuse and negate things, to rebel. The existentialists have talked a lot about this. Albert Camus, that's debate about whether he was an existentialist or not, depending on how you define it. But he wrote a book that was specifically called The Rebel, or in French, L'homme révolté, the man who has revolted. This plays a very important role. Dostoevsky has this underground man who is confronted with almost like a utopia and says, it won't be a utopia with me unless I can give the finger to the utopia. And why? It won't do any good whatsoever, but it will be the most advantageous advantage for me because I want to do it. Now, is he free? And we might look at that and say, that guy's not free at all. Look at him. He's an idiot. He's captivated by his own, clearly against his own interest kind of desires. Maybe, well, from certain perspectives on freedom, he isn't free. From his perspective on it, he is free, and he's asserting his very freedom in doing so. Yeah,
That's choice.
Yeah. Even if it's against our interests. Yeah. So the existentialists, they're playing around with a lot of different senses of freedom. And there's a few issues that get posed when we start. Freedom is one of those sort of things. Everybody loves it when we say it. I want to be free. But when we start thinking about it and we start thinking things through, it starts to get very complicated and messy. So one of the things that we can ask, and this is what a lot of philosophers of action and mind and other philosophies of play around with quite a bit, but also a lot of people outside of academic philosophy do it as well. To what degree does freedom really exist in a world where so much of the natural and then also so much of the social seems to restrict us or condition us, or if we want to be really, use strong language about it, to determine us. So, people will debate endlessly, nature or nurture, right? And usually the debate is presuming that, well, it's either one or the other, or a mixture of both, but that's what's supposed to be determining things. If so-and-so is this way, is he that way because of his genetics, because of what happened to him, maybe some brain damage or environmental factors, like he ate too much lead as a child, or is it because of the culture that he's in that he can't get out of, right? And what's always left out with nature or nurture is sort of the third polarity of it, which doesn't fit very well into the scientific paradigm, which is will or choice. To the degree that we aren't just determined by, and there's a lot that does determine us by our culture, and there's a lot that determines us by our biological makeup. But to the degree that we're not strictly determined by that, then we can say that we have some freedom. But it might just be a little sliver, you know? Freedom seems to be connected with the voluntary or what's chosen and what we view as good or right or desirable. So that means it's also connected with what we view as moral responsibility. And that's where freedom starts to get really messy and the stakes start to get really high. Because if people are free, then you can hold them responsible, which means that you can criticize them or praise them. I used to teach in a maximum security prison, and I would teach this intro to philosophy class every year. And one of the things that was a lot of fun happened every time, too. We would talk about freedom and determinism, and there would be some guy, you could see the gears turning in his head, and he'd say, wait a second, if everybody's determined, then the crimes that I committed, because most of these guys would say, yeah, I tell the judge and I tell the reporters who come in that I'm innocent, but I'm not, Very few of them would actually make claims to innocence with the teachers or their fellow prisoners. So the crimes that I did, I didn't really have a choice. So I shouldn't be held responsible. I should be let free. And then the guy next to him would say, well, let's follow that logic out. So if you're not responsible, because we're all just sort of, pawns or prey of social factors or whatever, that guard is too. And so is the judge who made the decision about you. And everybody just had to do things the way they did, so you stay in prison. And then the guy said, well, maybe I'm not such a fan of hard determinism anymore. But that's pretty important. We hold people responsible for what we think that they're free to do. If they're not free, then we say, well, you get a pass, or something tragic happened, right? Another thing we have to think about, and that's sort of spinning off of that, is how does our freedom connect up with, or interfere with, or impinge upon the freedom of others? And how does that affect us, too? And not just in the present, but also the past and the future. Does the choices that people made back in the past restrict our freedom? Certainly does, right? I mean, think about the way the city is laid out. All those sorts of choices. Or the fact that we do have to go to school. Maybe somebody could have decided we didn't. What about the future? We're in the same situation with the decisions we make. They can affect what our great-great-grandchildren are stuck with, the range of choices they have. Here's another question to think about. Can we make ourselves less free by the way that we use our freedom? Are there choices that we can make that are going to make us into less free people down the line? So sometimes we play around with this. You may have seen memes where somebody is complaining in the present about what past so-and-so did, You shouldn't have gotten drunk because now I'm hungover, They're talking about their past self. What are they discussing? They're talking about a way in which what you chose has restricted your options or your available courses in the future, or rather in that present. If that's the case, maybe we can make ourselves more free. Is it possible to increase our freedom? When we say things like, I don't like the fact that I alienate people by arguing with them. This is something I speak from experience from. I used to argue a lot as a kid. And then at a certain point, it took a lot of people telling me, something before I finally caught on. I thought, yeah, maybe there's something to that. Maybe I shouldn't be so argumentative. And then suddenly a whole range of relationships opened up for me that didn't exist before. We could come up with many, many examples like that. So these are some key, questions that we can think of with respect to freedom before we look at these existentialist thinkers. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I found myself doing in recent years is really looking at my perceptions of what freedom are in my life.
Yeah.
And making a concerted effort not to project them onto someone else. Because
Oh,
if you're judging someone because they're free,
yeah,
then you're doing it in the construct of what your freedom is. So I can say, as a woman and as a mother, I'm judging that woman as a mother because I wouldn't do that.
yeah,
But what her freedom is can be a very, very different thing if she's living in poverty or if she's living,
yeah,
you know, as a woman of a different race that has been brought up with a totally different social construct.
yeah,
And so I think thinking about what other people's freedoms are and how they're different from mine has actually made me a freer person because I don't feel as constricted in my thought process about how other people live. And I can, you know, there's less judgment, you know, when you have to put yourself into a situation when you're looking
yeah,
at someone else's freedom instead of just how they live, but thinking of it from an existential standpoint. What is their personal freedom?
Yeah.
You have to see it from a different perspective than your own.
yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's a challenge because it's impossible to like
You
actually
can't totally
use.
know.
Yeah, but you certainly, that is something you can work on. When we talk about empathizing with another person, I think that's one aspect of it that we often leave up because the talk about empathy usually focuses on like, you know, the affective part. You feel empathy towards them, but that being able to let go of the need to project onto them exactly the same circumstances that we have. Yeah.
That explains being a grandparent. Because your children would say, you didn't do that to us when we were grandparents. And then the grandchildren come along and they have all this freedom and you don't fuss at them for it. It's kind of the same thing. I'm not in a place of judgment, but learning to be a parent, sometimes you're in this place of judgment all the time.
Right,
You gotta
right.
do this with it.
Yeah.
But then the
That's true.
grandchildren come along, it's like,
You have
Well,
other life experiences.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
inform
yeah,
that.
so we gotta
Yeah.
help you understand.
And the stakes aren't as high too, because you can always have a goal, right?
Yeah, no one will blame you.
The lines of responsibility really differ
Yeah.
from grandparents and parents, and can.
Yeah, and I suppose we could say that about all sorts of different roles, you know. Like when somebody first starts teaching, for example, and this is probably the case with many professions, they're going to make a lot of mistakes, and they don't want to show that they're making mistakes because there's a lot of pressure, and they often, you know, they've learned some things in whatever training they were going through, but it's never the same thing as what they actually face. And teaching is very much that way. You can do as many lesson plans as you like, but then you get in the classroom with 20 kids, and it's a whole different ballgame. And you know, it's interesting too because you could, if you're in any situation where you're dealing with other people, practically every job that we do is dealing with other people. You're dealing in part with other people's freedom in one way or another. So you know, you'd be a terrible. Just imagine a waiter who's like, no, you don't want that because I don't want that. I would eat this dish. I'll bring it to you. You know, it'd be a terrible waiter, right? And so we could multiply all sorts of examples like that. Well, let's talk about existentialism and anxiety itself, and a little bit of historical context. Because existentialism, you know, we're talking about the 19th, and it really is rolling in the 19th, but it only gets identified as such in the 20th century, and it didn't catch on here as something until like the 1950s or so. It's like a French import post-war, although there were a lot of other people besides the French who were doing it. So existentialism doesn't produce or discover anxiety. It would be kind of crazy, I think, to suggest that you know, they came up with it, although I've seen some people do that. The modern age really is an age of anxiety for some good reasons. And we'll talk about how the existentialists thought about that in a bit, but there's a few sort of keynotes that I wanted to hit on. There was this guy, Blaise Pascal, and he was a contemporary of René Descartes. So we're talking about the beginnings of modernity in the 17th century. And he said a couple things that were interesting. He's pretty famous for, if you've heard anything by him, it's that the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know, or you know, other paraphrases of that. But he talks about, he's got this phrase, the eternal silence of these infinite spheres terrifies me. When we went from a geocentric, with the world, the earth in the middle, I notice I said the world, right? The earth in the middle, and then the rest of the cosmos around us, to a more modern scientific way of looking at it, it really sent a lot of people off their hinges. Pascal was a very, very smart guy, major mathematician, first-rate philosopher. He was not a dummy in any respect, so it's not like he was, suddenly confronted by thinking the world was flat and finding out that it was round or anything along those lines. He's experiencing what it's like to think of a universe that is vaster than we could possibly comprehend and that doesn't care a thing about us. That's anxiety-provoking for a lot of people, especially if you've been thinking about a universe where the angels are moving the spheres and everything has its purpose and its place. The modern period is a period of revolutions, of things going in very different ways. And the French Revolution is a great example. Our American Revolution, produces a new country, a new way of doing things. The French Revolution was a lot deeper than the American Revolution. It was against a lot more than our revolution was, and it ended up producing what was called the Terror. The idea of freedom led to this bloodletting that consumed the people who got it started, like Robespierre. Somebody else who didn't get a chance to get her head cut off because she died too young in it, somebody who I like quite a bit, but who wrote about what happened to women in the Revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft. She writes a great book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and the reason she writes it is precisely because the French minister, I think it was the Minister of Education, wants to propose, because of the Revolution, because of universal human rights, men should all get public school, women domestic training at home. And she's like, there's something wrong with this, right? And she makes some great arguments in her work. And if it wasn't for her and some other women, some of whom did get guillotined, like Olympe de Gouges, standing up for that, it would have been entirely a men's revolution. And we can go on and on and on. Simone de Beauvoir is sort of like the end point of that line of development. Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote with Engels, talks about a specter is haunting Europe. And of course that specter was communism, but it wasn't just communism. It was, wait a second, what the hell is going on here? Things are really changing fast. And these relations that we have that seem to make sense of our world, like that guy lives over there and he's a lord, and that person lives there and he's a guild master. All of those things are starting to disappear. That produces anxiety. All the social relations changing. We could talk about colonialism and the notion of progress and how that, by the time of the First World War, pretty much fell apart. The notion that we were rational people and the world was just getting better and better, in part because the Europeans were colonizing everything and the English were leading the way. You can see, if you ever read the book Heart of Darkness by Conrad, it's a very ambiguous text. And the character in it is talking about civilization as being more or less a good thing, and how the Britons at one time were savages, total savages when the Romans were coming up. And by the time that you get to the end of the text, it's very unclear about what, if anything, is being brought by civilization. And genocide is sort of the answer to something. Exterminate them all. The Apocalypse Now is the retelling of that story, the movie Apocalypse Now. So this age is an age of anxiety. If you think about what we're anxious about today, we were just talking about this before we began. We have increasing technology being incorporated everywhere, putting a lot of people out of work. We don't have a lot of other ways to provide them with work. Our traditional answer to that has been, let's send everybody to college, but we're finding out that doesn't really provide an answer. College students are graduating and finding that there aren't the jobs that they wanted. My generation found that, the Generation X, when we graduated, but now it's become particularly acute. And there's this pressing question, what are we going to do when half of the population doesn't have anything to do? How are they going to live? Are we going to have something like a universal basic income? But that's fine. What are they going to do all day? And these are the questions that should provoke a lot of anxiety, and not a lot of people are talking about them. Why aren't they? Well, because they're busy doing Pokemon and you know, talking about the election.
Distractions.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
I think one of the things we saw in the centuries before is when things, the social systems were imposed on people,
Yeah.
that level of anxiety in itself
Yeah.
created all kinds of systems of disorganization within what people perceived were organized systems.
Yeah.
Families, tribes, culture, etc. Whether it was, here in the United States, the Native American population, or it was in Africa, or places
Yeah.
like that, the imposing of a construct. You have to be this way, and this is what's going to make your life better if you can be this.
Or keep you from getting killed.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you freedom.
Yeah.
And I think over time, what sometimes feels like a betrayal of freedom because it's not accepted. What people are doing is probably exactly what you said before, which is the questioning of that.
Yeah.
The idea of what's my choice in this? Did I have any choice? And so you have people going back and saying, let's reenact the idea of choice. And so you mentioned civil disobedience and other kind of things. You have people rebelling against rules and things.
Yeah.
So I'm going to challenge this because the way it was great. It created a lot of anxiety in me.
Yeah.
In my social circle, in my community, those kind of things like that. And so when you look at the movements that started behind that was a kind of a collective anxiety.
Yeah, and those would be
That's
cases
kind of
where.
what we've all been a part of these
Yeah.
kind of movement pieces, but what it's answering something, it's trying to answer something.
Yeah.
Respond to the anxiety that people are feeling about the rules that maybe at this time we have to relook at those rules again.
Yeah.
And we're all in this together. But how do we do this together?
Those would be cases, I think, where anxiety is leading to something progressive, But it can always go. What it makes people even more anxious, it can always go off the rails, Any progressive movement can turn into some abusive thing of its own, but so there is some stuff that these existentialist figures,
Yeah.
particularly Simone de Beauvoir, have to say about that I think could be really helpful. So let's jump into them. We'll talk about her last, though. So the guy who really deserves to get talked about first is this guy Søren Kierkegaard, who's a Dane, dies pretty young in his 40s, and he wrote a book called The Concept of Anxiety, which is not really his most illuminating work in discussing anxiety, but is pretty interesting. And it sets the stage for these existentialists, in part because he distinguishes between anxiety and fear. Fear is of something determinate. Anxiety is more broad, right? It can have objects that it picks on, but there's always something more that you're anxious about. And he talks about being on a high building, for an example. Sartre uses this one in his writings as well. So you go up to a high building, and you could fear falling off. You could fear the wind blowing you off, for example. Or you feel if you ever go like in Holy Hill, have any of you ever been up in the tower there? You can actually feel the tower like go back and forth in the wind. That's pretty scary, right? Maybe the whole thing will fall down. But anxiety goes beyond that. The person who feels anxiety realizes that they could throw themselves off. And that's something distinctively human. I mean, animals can do crazy stuff too. And you might say, well, why the hell would you throw yourself off? And the person can say, yeah, you're right, why would I? And yet I'm still kind of worried in the back of my mind that I might do that. People get anxious about relationships that way. I'm going to screw it up. Why would you screw it up? Don't you understand how to talk to your mate, your spouse, whoever? Yeah, I do, but I still might screw it up anyway. And we can say this about all sorts of, as a teacher, maybe I'll screw up my students, maybe I'll get in class, and I had these dreams for a while where I would show up. This is a total digression, but it's kind of a funny thing to talk about. So I would have these dreams for like the first couple of years that I was teaching. And I would show up, and it would be a lecture like this, and I wouldn't have any notes with me. There'd be like a whole auditorium of students, like those auditoriums where you have 500 people sitting in there. And I'd start chit-chatting with some of the students, and I'd realize I had no idea what class it was, or where we were in the semester, or what I was supposed to be talking about that day. And I would see the clock, and I'd be like, well, I got an hour and a half I got to fill. What am I going to talk about? So I'd start chatting with the students with this kind of hope that maybe something they would say would trigger something in my mind, and I would remember what I'm supposed to be teaching about. Because I'm the teacher. If I screw it up, who knows what will happen with all these students, right? And they would never help me out. It was always too vague. I could never figure out what precisely I was. So I just started trying to eat up time. You learn tricks to do that sort of thing, talk in very vague terms. I knew professors who do that the entire semester. Maybe some of you have as well. But, the notion that I could screw it up like that, that's an example of anxiety. People have all sorts of anxieties that way. And he's got a discussion of original sin and Adam in there, but I think for our purposes that's not quite so interesting. The upshot of it is that anxiety comes out of our freedom. Our freedom is something that we ourselves can't completely control, because if we did, it wouldn't really be freedom. We can, at each point in time, kind of will ourselves to do what we know to be the right thing, or the prudent thing. But there's always that sense that we might screw it up. My young son sometimes says stuff like that, where he knows he's not supposed to do something, and he'll say it this way: well, I hope I don't do it. And I'll say, well, wait a second, you can keep yourself from doing it. He says, no, not really. I can choose not to do it here, I can choose not to do it here, but at a certain point I'll not pay attention and then I'll do it. So I really hope I don't do that. And there's a lot of things along those lines for us. So Kierkegaard kind of gets it started. Another thing that he talks about that I think is really helpful, he's got a book called The Present Age. And in that, he talks about his own present age, which is the 1840s. And he's talking about the creation of a public through the press. Now, you've got to remember, what is that at that time? Newspapers. He's in a small town, in Copenhagen, in Denmark, so everybody kind of knows everybody. And the turnaround time is fairly quick. But there's nothing like social media at the time. But everything that he has to say about the crowd, about the public, about the press, and their irresponsibility in his sense, and the fact that if you tie yourself in with this sort of stuff, you can't really be an individual, that being an individual is not something you can presume, it's something you have to work at all the time by the way you use your freedom. All that could be said even more in the age of social media, where we're connected with each other through, I'm connected with people through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google+, sometimes the same people connecting through the same things. Some of them email me as well. Hey, I don't like what you posted here, But so he points out that it's a task to become an individual. It's not just something we can automatically assume. It's something we have to fight towards. Now, he framed it in a sort of religious way in terms of becoming a Christian. And again, we can probably take some of the theological ballast out. The upshot of it was that he thought that whatever sort of structures we had, what we were talking about as social constructs, what we can call the social sphere, it's up to us whether we allow ourselves to be confined to that. There's a lot of pressure to do so, but we can, in fact, say, I'm going to go beyond that. Now, when we do that, it's an incredible risk. There's no guarantee that when we buck the system with a capital S, we're not going to get crushed, or we're not going to find out that we screwed up and we really made the wrong choice. But it is something that we only find out by committing to. He talks about it in terms of faith, and he doesn't mean faith in the sense of like blind belief. He means faith in the sense of what he calls the highest passion and making a choice over and over again. Friedrich Nietzsche is another guy, another great existentialist. He's the guy who said God is dead, not just once, but a number of times. And what he meant by that isn't that some guy in the sky, the way, like on Family Guy, they picture God, has actually died and we've had a funeral or something like that. What he means is our sources of our highest value have been revealed as lacking, as contingent, as up to us. Because if you take, if it's God or the king or the people in terms of democracy or whatever it is that you're going to set up here and say, well, I gotta take my directives from that because that's what's really telling me the right way to live and has all the answers for me. Take that out of the picture, and now it's just you. That's pretty anxiety provoking, and Nietzsche thinks that that's the danger that modern culture is in. He calls it nihilism. And he thinks that a lot of people try to escape this by living inauthentic lives where they just find something to latch onto and obey that. So, if you take religion out of the picture, you can substitute science. And, post all sorts of memes about how there's even a site, I effing love science, right? And, that's not much different than posting religious memes all the time. It's the same sort of commitment that demands just as little, and it's just as soporific to thinking. Nietzsche thinks that we need to break away from all of those sorts of systems. He also has a lot of other ideas tied in there. He thinks of the human being as fundamentally what he calls will to power, and that's some people have more of that, some people have less, but why do they have more? Because they choose to have more. So you see how freedom gets involved there. Again, there's a terrible risk. If you're going to be different than other people, if you're going to carve out for yourself a new way to live, you're really walking out onto a tightrope. And there's nothing to catch you if you fall. So understandably, a lot of people would say, maybe I'll skip that. Certainties of our culture are good enough for me. But Nietzsche's writing to the people that he thinks are willing to take that jump. If we move ahead to this guy, Martin Heidegger, and I realize I'm going through this very quickly because I do want to be respectful of your time. He's a guy who thinks that mood or affectivity is fundamentally disclosive of our reality just as much as our thinking is, or our willing, let alone our scientific processes and our technology. And he thinks that there's one mood that's particularly revealing of our condition: anxiety. Because anxiety shows us where we really are. Nothing is absolutely for certain, except for the fact that we're going to die, but we don't really know what that means. He talks about us as being towards death. Everything else, all of the constructs or projections that we can sort of push out there onto the world, none of them actually manage to control it or encompass it. So there's always things that can rise up and show themselves to us that we can try to push away and repress, or we can deal with. He also talks about a lot of ways people try to not feel that anxiety. He's one of the people who thinks anxiety is part of the human condition, and the proof of that is that hardly anybody shows it. Why? Because they're finding ways to distract themselves. He has some nice phrases for this. He's got one, Geschwätze, idle talk. We might call it bullshitting around. People just chatter about this and that. And again, social media is one way we do this a lot. Nowadays, you want to just some idle talk, just look at your friends' posts and click share. Now you just talked, right? It's the same thing. You don't even have to like put a little comment about it. Curiosity, and he doesn't mean curiosity like we should never think about anything or be curious about anything. But there's a kind of curiosity that just jumps from object to object to object to object, and it never really lingers on any of them. So it's not the curiosity that leads us into, studying something, or getting to know a person really deeply, or thinking about ourselves and our lives and how we might want to unscrew them off or anything like that. It's the curiosity that says, oh, what's he doing? Oh, what's he doing? What's he doing? That sort of thing. We could phrase that in a very contemporary sense. What's on? Right? When we used to still, before we had streaming, when we actually had to like flip the channels, and we had with cable, we could have 100 channels. You could sit there on the couch, we called it couch surfing, right? Because you sat there on the couch and just click channels, you'd be like, none of this is really that good. But I wonder if there's something over on that channel. Now, people find themselves spending a night going through Netflix or Hulu, never actually watching anything, looking at the descriptions of things, putting them in their queues, saving them for later, and never getting to them. That's what he's talking about is curiosity. And we could think of all sorts of other ways in which it happens. And he thinks that we do this to avoid anxiety. Maybe there's something to that. So Heidegger thinks that if we want to live an authentic life, we have to actually face our anxiety. And that's tough to do, in part because facing our fears, that's fairly straightforward. I'm afraid that, I'm going to run out of money, or I won't have clients, or I'll fall down a well, or who knows what else, right? And some fears are irrational, granted, right? But anxiety never runs out of objects. So to face up to your anxiety is not something you can do and finish. It's something that's like an ongoing lived process, but at least it means being authentic for Heidegger. Now you might say, well, that's too high of a cost. If that's what authenticity is, doesn't sound too hot. I'd rather watch Netflix some more. That's a choice. That we have the freedom to do that. There's nothing that can compel us to make one choice or the other. So this is a good lead into Sartre now. Now Sartre takes over from Heidegger. Sartre is known as the philosopher of radical freedom. And all that really means is that Sartre thinks, this is where his friend Simone de Beauvoir will disagree with him, Sartre thinks that everything we do, everything that we make of ourselves, we ultimately choose. That doesn't mean that you chose to be a man or a woman, or born in Wisconsin or not born in Wisconsin. We didn't choose that sort of stuff. But what we make of that, that's totally up to us. Whatever frame of reference we use to make sense of it, totally up to us. Nobody else gets to choose it. They can bring pressure on us and say, if you don't do things this way, I'm going to punish you. We could say, screw you, I'm not going to do it your way. So if we don't, it's our choice. So Sartre holds people totally responsible for everything. And he says most people live in an inauthentic life marked by what he calls bad faith. He's got this famous example of the waiter. If you ever read Sartre, he talks about a waiter who's sort of pretending to be a waiter because they would like to think of themselves as an object rather than as a subject. I think we could come up with all sorts of permutations to do this in the age of the hipster, that are even more interesting. Just go downtown and go to the Third Ward, and you can do all sorts of interesting Sartrean thought experiments looking at people. But the general idea is somebody tries to make themselves into no longer a subject who's responsible, but an object. He also has an example of a woman who goes out on a date. She knows that the guy is basically just interested in sleeping with her. She tries to, keep that out of her mind. The guy starts putting the moves on her, and she's like pretending like he doesn't. I don't remember exactly what it was, but imagine like somebody put the arm around them and pretend like they're yawning and that sort of thing. And she knows exactly where things are going, but she's lying to herself about it, so she doesn't have to deal with the fact that she really has to make a choice. She doesn't like the guy, so it's do I break the date off or not break the date off? Either one seems like an option she doesn't like. This is a way to escape anxiety, to make other people responsible, other things responsible. And so Sartre is really a stickler when it comes to this sort of thing. And you know, to be fair, I think he was pretty consistent in how he applied it to himself. Now Simone de Beauvoir, who was his friend, his lifetime lover, his accomplice in quite a few things as well, she thought that he was wrong about some of this. She said that some people are in conditions where they really don't have as much freedom. And what she was really talking about was like liberation movements and the third world and oppressed minorities in the first world, you know, that sort of thing. And her view was that it doesn't make sense to talk about somebody who is, you know, in the bourgeoisie and really has a lot of resources and doesn't encounter the same sort of, say, discrimination or oppression that somebody else does, as having just the exact same amount of freedom as somebody who is placed in a situation of terror day in and day out. So, you know, if we think, for example, what it must be like to live in Yemen right now, people in Yemen, for Simone de Beauvoir, would not be in the same condition as far as freedom. They would have less ontological freedom, less fundamental freedom than we do. Now, that could change, right? We could have a totalitarian dictatorship here. Things could turn great over there, and then maybe the situation is reversed. But it is important, she thought, that we recognize that so that we don't, you know, hold people so responsible and say, oh, well, it's your own damn fault, so, you know, too bad on you. We can be more empathetic towards them. She also thought, as opposed to Sartre, see, Sartre thought that the world was ultimately meaningless. Whatever meaning there is, we give it to it. When you say it like that and you think it through, it's kind of hard to be really that enthusiastic about it, you know? I mean, maybe for some people they're like, oh man, that sounds great. Make the world however I want to. You know, like narcissists, for example, right? But for those of us who aren't narcissists, the anxiety of having to like make the meaning of the world is kind of a downer. De Beauvoir said, no, it's ambiguous. It has lots of meanings. The trouble is that you can't expect everybody else to agree with your meaning. So that means that you have to sort of work things through. You have to have dialogue. And some ways in which people do live in the world are better than others. She gives some examples, and again, these are ways people deal with that anxiety of having to choose. And so I'll sort of close by giving you some of these character types. She talks about a sub-person as somebody who pretends that they don't have any freedom at all. They avoid all questions of freedom. They assume themselves not free. The person who turns themselves just into like a tool for somebody else and says, I have no responsibility whatsoever. Right? Another one is the serious person. And she doesn't mean serious in the same way that we mean it. She means it with the sense of the spirit of seriousness. The person who thinks that there is some preordained set of values that they can get in touch with and just follow and embody, and those will make sense out of everything. She sees it as sort of a reversion to childhood in some ways. These would be, as she says, unconditioned. So, you know, it could be a political party. The party's always right. It could be some sort of cause. Some people do that with things that are, you know, in some respects quite good, like animal liberation, for example. You know, our factory farming processes are pretty barbaric. They're also pretty new. Things are very different than, say, when I was a kid in terms of how pigs are farmed compared to today. Things that might have been okay to eat back then, ethically, pretty problematic now. But that doesn't mean that I have to like turn that into the be-all and end-all of my life, and that everybody who eats meat is a horrible person, and I can divide the world up into the, you know, the good and the bad that way. That would be what she's talking about there. That's one way in which people deal with the ambiguity and the anxiety that it provokes. They use their freedom to, you know, essentially divide the world up into two camps. The nihilist, person who's failed at some sort of serious project, decides that nothing matters, they decide not to try anything at all. She sees that as a kind of cop-out. The adventurer, the person who engages in life projects, they throw themselves into it, but they don't really pay attention to what the damage is to other people, what the consequences are. We think of the way some people travel and like go to sacred sites of other people and march around in them. And I think something like that might be going on in Pokemon Go right now. I think people are complaining about that. That would be the adventurer, right? And then the passionate person cares enthusiastically about their goal. They place everything in motion. But again, they don't pay attention to its effects on others. They don't recognize the freedom of other people. What de Beauvoir said, that is a good place to close off with, and some of the things that you guys have been saying is echoed by that. She says that genuine freedom requires that we acknowledge and we respect the freedom of others, and that if we need to, we work for the freedom of others. If we have enough freedom where we're in a privileged position, we ought to use it to try to expand the range of freedom. Sartre said something kind of similar, but not quite as explicit as she did. She was very good about making the commitments of the existentialist more explicit. There's still a few, things sort of left unresolved. I mean, it could be that maybe the existentialists are wrong and we're not all anxious. I like to think that they actually are right about that, but there's no scientific way of proving that. It's not particularly compelling to tell somebody, well, the proof that you're anxious is that you're denying your anxiety. I don't know that really works that well. They have to have an experience where it comes to the fore. So de Beauvoir and other people have told us how we can think about our own anxiety and other people's freedom. I think that we also have to think about our anxiety, and I know this as, for example, a parent. Our anxiety not just for ourselves, but for those that we care about. Like I think about, what my kids are going through in adolescence, and the fact that I can maybe set down some guardrails that keep them from totally going off into the abyss, but that there's really not much beyond that other than waiting around to be there when they screw up, making sure they don't totally ruin their lives. Just like when they were 3, 4 years old, it was keeping them from killing themselves, because they find kids will do crazy stuff, and I do too. But that sort of concern, or you can think about how it is for people that we know, that we also care about for other reasons. Parents and children are one. We talk about friends. We talk about parents. We talk about people living on our street, And then we can also talk about really big picture things. If we're not so anxious about Russia and the United States squaring off and blowing everything up, maybe maybe if that's no longer the anxiety-provoking thing it was for people in the 1980s, maybe the damage that we're doing environmentally to the planet that we don't seem to be able to do much about politically with either party, coalition that we've got, maybe that should be anxiety-provoking. The idea that we might leave a ruined world behind in a couple generations. Or other things, like the issue about, well, what are we going to do when technology has put so many people out of work? How are we going to, do we just want to entertain them? That seems sort of like treating them like cattle, Is that what people really deserve? How do we ensure a true human life, which is supposed to be the promise of technology, right? It's supposed to make our world better. That should be anxiety-provoking, I think. I don't know that the existentialists really have that much to tell us about those kinds of anxiety yet, but we could maybe steer them into that. So that's all I've got. I've actually gone a little over time, but we do have time for question and answer or discussion. Anything else that you guys want to talk about? I also have a little thing, if you want to learn about more events that we've got coming up, you can put your email and name on the list, and we'll put you on our mailing list. But any questions or comments, or is there quite a, oh,
You know, one other question, I think,
sure.
very good observation, you know. We've had an opportunity to hear about the thinkers of the past.
Oh,
Who are the new thinkers now that are taking the understanding of the past, living in this age, or a few decades, maybe in the 1900s, or
Yeah.
far into who are the new thinkers that are out here that are now merging some of what is the old, but then these new trends
yeah.
that don't fit any model are showing up in the human experience? Who are
Well,
the new?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, I don't have a lot of, it's not like I have a sort of comprehensive
Are
thing.
you
So,
one of
in a very minor way. I mean, I'm writing blog entries rather than books about it, so you know, it's not quite the same. And you know, I deal with clients, right? But that's dealing, and I like the fact that it's with one person at a time rather than a mass audience. But there are some people who are thinking a lot about these topics. The trouble with my giving an answer, and I will, is that it's going to be very selective because I just don't read all that extensively in the field. One of the things that I am connected with is, and it's different from existentialist philosophy, there's a whole revival of Stoic philosophy that's going on. The Neo-Stoic movement, and it's spread out through a bunch of different things. And they're grappling with some of the same issues. They have somewhat different answers, and some of these thinkers actually criticize the Stoics, like Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre. And the Stoics tend to focus on making the distinction between what is really in your control and what isn't in your control, and then working on what is in your control.
Yeah.
It's actually the original basis for cognitive behavior therapy and all those sort of related approaches. There's other thinkers who are big name philosophers that are touching on these issues of, say, anxiety and freedom and what we ought to be doing about society with these new problems that we're facing. Alistair McIntyre would be an example of somebody who I particularly like. Hope he lives a lot longer and keeps writing. In Europe, one really important guy is Jürgen Habermas, who's very concerned about the nature of democracy and how it's going to continue. He's very critical of what's going on in the EU at present, and he's been for a while. And there's a number of other people who are much better placed, you might say. That they're, and this is actually a good point. Philosophers, they got to, we say they got to put their pants on like everybody else, one leg at a time. They have to live the same sort of life in the mess that we do, so they have to speculate about those things in part.
And sometimes it's good to have people who can have the 10,000 foot view of things.
Yeah.
And can see how all this stuff connects.
I'll say something that's going to seem a little bit, perhaps, envious. Maybe it is. It's really easy to have the 10,000 foot view when you've got a great, teaching research position and lots of backing from which to do it. I kind of think that it's great that we do have those sorts of things, and we're actually living in a wonderful time. I've done a lot of knocking of the internet tonight, but it does really open up a lot of opportunities for people to study on their own and make contacts with other people. So I really love that stuff. And with the people doing all the, big research work where they get to give a lecture series at, they turn into Gifford lectures or whatever, and then write some more books. That's great. And then the rest of us down here at the middle level can keep on plowing away with what we do as well. And I think what we're doing here is just as valuable as what the elites are doing. Because we're just as much, people as they are, but that's, I doubt there'll be any disagreement here about that sort of thing, right? It's an easy thing to say. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I read someplace that our life is, since the beginning of time, our life is worth 1/billionth of a second. And I think about that. It helps me put my life in perspective,
Yeah.
because I'm not here to save the world. I'm here to do what life presents me and to respond to it. I'm here to vote and
Yeah.
participate. But most things that go on, I can't do anything about.
Yeah.
The universe is keeping expanding and, it's going on. Evolution is going on.
Yeah.
And when I think of, how insignificant I am as a single person, that helps relieve my anxiety and it helps me to kind of see things in perspective and
Yeah.
not get all hot and bothered about things I cannot change or
Yeah,
do anything about.
the Stoics have this exercise that people do nowadays. It's like a visualization exercise. And you start out right where you are, and then imagine yourself like going up into the air and seeing, your city, and then, the world, and then the cosmos. And it does really actually help people out, because you can realize that. I mean, the choices that we make do matter, right? Because I can really hurt other people. By the way I behave, I can help people sometimes. Usually more ways we can hurt people than help people. But yeah, and
I mean, it's good to think
I don't
about all
have
these
to,
things.
yeah, I don't have to
but,
save the whole
actually,
world, or
Yeah, that's interesting.
It sure does make you anxious though when you feel like you do have to save the whole world, or even like save your city. I mean, think about what it would take if you thought, and this would be like a crazy thought, right? That somehow you were responsible uniquely for the city of Wauwatosa and the happiness of everybody in it. Now, this is not a huge city, right? You could conceivably go door to door and meet everybody. It would still be totally nuts, and it would drive you nuts to have some sort of project like that. Sometimes even just trying to make your family happy can drive you nuts, depending on their makeup, dynamics, things like that. Yeah.
There's some people, and I've been in circles like that, who have a capacity to handle those levels of anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
They really do, and so
You mean where they feel that they're responsible for everything?
they may be responsible for 5,000 people.
Oh,
And
yeah.
how they handle that, from the minor little things that may be in operation, where they've got to deal with a small team to
Yeah.
5,000 people, and you've got to do these kind of things.
It usually seems like the people who are successful at it are able to realize at a certain point where their responsibility ends.
And they learn how to channel the energy of the anxiety.
Yeah,
And I guess that's what I heard her saying.
yeah.
You learn how to just move it as you need to move it.
Yeah, I mean, the existentialists are right. We're never going to totally get rid of it. And it would be a mistake to, as far as our own development, to try to just mute it out or, use drugs to dope it out, But it can certainly go bad in a lot of ways, too.
I call it radar.
Radar, you said?
It's radar.
Yeah, I mean, anxiety is useful in part because it does put us on our guard against the things that can go wrong so that we are attentive. But it can go haywire very easily because there's so many things in our environment that could be going wrong at any given moment. It has a long-term effect on us. So, well, let me draw this to a close. Thank you very much for your attendance and your great questions. And we'll try to do another one of these maybe later on in the year. I got to talk with the librarians about it, but we'll do something else on existentialism. Another big theme, I think, with it, introduction to some of the figures. So, thanks.